Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're venturing into the darkest corners of America's wilderness, places where the trail ends, the road bends, and the night swallows every sound. I'll be sharing a collection of true encounters and chilling legends from remote mountains, shadowed forests, and lonely backroads across the country. These aren't campfire myths. These are real experiences that linger long after the sun goes down. So grab a blanket, kill the lights, and settle in for a journey where beauty meets terror. Don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and share your own eerie stories in the comments. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The Whistle Beyond the Tree Line. I pitched camp on a bald ridge late in the afternoon, high enough that the wind carried the smell of wet stone. Clouds moved low and slow, dragging shadows across the slopes like the brush of a hand over corduroy. The trail up had been narrow and mean, nothing but switchbacks stitched into rock, and I'd chosen this spot because it sat just above the tree line where the laurel and spruce broke apart, giving me a clear circle of ground and a view of the valleys folding into each other. I thought that openness would make me feel safer. It didn't. It made the dark look bigger. By sundown, the woods were reduced to shapes, tall black teeth gnawing at the edge of the ridge. The quiet wasn't just absence of sound. It was padded, like the world had been wrapped in heavy curtains. Even my own movements seemed muffled. I boiled a little water, ate without hurry, and kept the lantern low so I could watch the horizon. Around midnight, after the last ember dimmed, I heard it. 3 notes, soft and careful, coming from the laurel just downhill. Not a tune I recognized, just a rise, a fall, and a rise again, the way someone might practice a whistle without wanting to disturb anyone nearby. Before I thought better of it, I answered with a single low note, a habit from childhood hikes with my uncle, when we'd use sound to keep track of each other. Only this time, the answer came not from where I'd heard the original, but from somewhere off to my right. Same 3 notes, just far enough away to feel deliberate. I frowned, turning my head, listening for movement. Nothing followed. Then, minutes later, another set of notes from behind me. I tried to tell myself it was the wind teasing through the rhododendron, but wind doesn't imitate rhythm, and it doesn't move in a circle. I cut the lantern and the night sank in like water, thick and cold. Without light, the air itself felt heavier, and I could almost hear the clouds dragging past the ridge. The whistling kept to its pattern, slow, unhurried, changing position with each round. It wasn't angry. It didn't seem meant to drive me off. It was learning, adjusting. When I moved my pack to the other side of the fire ring, the next set of notes drifted to that side, as if tracking where my voice had been rather than where I was now. My skin prickled. The memory of small sounds from earlier in the evening, snaps of twig in the leaf duff, came back sharp. I told myself it was deer pushing through brush. Now, I wasn't so sure. I sat still for what felt like hours. The whistle would fade for long stretches, just enough for my shoulders to loosen, then return from a new place, sometimes near, sometimes far. At one point I thought I saw a flicker in the tree line, like moonlight catching on metal, but when I stared, the shape dissolved into the branches. The temperature kept dropping, and by the time the first thin light of dawn touched the ridge, my fingers ached. That's when I saw it. By my boots, resting neatly on the flattened grass, was a smooth riverstone, dark, slick, and cold enough to bite my skin. I turned it in my hand, looking for marks, but it was clean. There was no stream anywhere near camp, nothing but ridgeline and hard ground for a mile or more. I left it where it was. I packed fast, skipping coffee, every motion feeling watched. The walk down the switchbacks was slow in the dim light, the kind of half-dark where you can't tell if something is moving in the periphery or if it's just your own eyes adjusting. More than once, I caught the sense of a shape holding still just uphill, always a little behind. No sound, no more whistling. When I reached the base and the first houses came into view, that feeling of being accompanied didn't lift. It just changed, like whatever had been there had passed me off to the valley without crossing its own boundary. Weeks later, at home, I tried to hum those 3 notes to see if they still carried the weight they had on the ridge. I couldn't get them right, not even close. They belonged to that height, to the line where the trees thin out and the wind has room to listen. I don't plan on going back up there, but some nights, when the wind moves around my house in just the right way, I catch myself expecting to hear those notes again, patient, unhurried, already adjusting to where I've been. Story 2. Footsteps circling my lantern light. I set up camp just off an old fire road that hadn't seen a vehicle in decades. The gravel was mostly gone, buried under moss and dirt, but the shape of it still cut through the woods like a forgotten scar. I picked the spot because it was quiet, flat enough for my tent, and far from the main trail. The forest on both sides was thick with rhododendrons, their tangled branches knitting together overhead, letting in only a thin strip of darkening sky. I remember thinking it felt like being inside a tunnel, safe from wind, safe from sight. I didn't think about what might already be in the tunnel with me. By the time I'd eaten and got the lantern lit, the night had settled in fully. The lantern gave off that small gold circle of light that makes you feel warm until you look past it and realize you can't see more than a few feet into the dark. Out there, beyond that reach, the rhododendron made a solid wall. Every now and then, I could hear leaves shift in the distance, but it was just enough sound to remind me how deep the stillness ran here. The first footsteps came while I was bent over my pack, soft, so soft they almost could have been the settling of soil or the slide of leaves down a bank. I only noticed because they came in pairs, deliberate, one after the other. I looked up, expecting to see a deer at the edge of the light, but there was nothing, just the brush, still and heavy. Then they came again, not closer, not farther, just there, at the edge where my eyes couldn't make out anything but the hint of motion. I called out, "Hello?" And whatever it was stopped completely. The quiet after was so sudden, it felt like my own voice had scared the air into holding still. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, waiting for movement when it started again. Only this time, it wasn't random. It matched my breathing. Inhale, 1 step. Exhale, 1 step. I didn't believe it at first, so I changed my breathing. Quick, shallow puffs to throw it off. The steps adjusted instantly, light and exact, like a mirror trained on my lungs. I told myself it was my imagination, but the pattern kept on, so precise I could count along. The ground here was soft, springy with years of leaf mold, and I knew it would hold an impression. If someone, or something, was moving around me, I'd see proof in the morning. I kept the lantern close and decided to stay put. The steps didn't stop. They didn't rush or retreat. They just stayed at that edge, pacing my breath. When I held it, they held it. When I let it out, they started again. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, trying to pretend thin fabric meant safety. I woke up several times to faint crunches of leaves, always in time with the way my chest rose and fell. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion won, and I slept. In the morning, I stepped out expecting to see clear prints in the soil, but there was nothing, only my own tracks, looping in a clumsy half-circle around camp where I'd paced earlier, and the untouched carpet of leaves beyond. I walked the perimeter, scanning every inch, but the moss and dirt lay smooth as if no one had been there in years. I almost convinced myself I dreamed the whole thing, until I spotted something in the ditch beside the road, a faint set of prints, smaller than mine, walking in a perfectly straight line. No dragging, no unevenness, just neat, light impressions like a child had walked there years ago and never came back to press their weight down again. They didn't lead anywhere, just started and ended within a few yards. By afternoon, the memory of the footsteps had faded enough that I considered staying another night. I built a small fire, made coffee, and tried not to glance too often into the darkening brush. But as the light drained from the sky, the steps came back. Same weight, same patience, keeping to the edge of my vision. They didn't follow me when I moved around camp. They kept circling, deliberate and measured, never breaking the ring they'd made. The longer it went on, the more it felt like they weren't trying to approach at all. They were watching, measuring, seeing how long I'd last before leaving, which way I'd run if fear finally won. Every so often they'd pause, as if marking the time, and then resume, always finding the rhythm of my breathing again. I tried speaking into the dark. I said I wasn't here to bother anyone, that I'd be gone in the morning. My voice sounded small in the space between the lantern light and the brush. The steps stopped for a long while, long enough that I thought maybe it had ended. But then, just as my pulse slowed, they started again, unhurried, as if answering. I barely slept that night. Each time I drifted off, some faint shift in the air or scrape of leaf would pull me back awake, reminding me I was still part of whatever slow orbit was happening here. When dawn came, the relief was muted. Nothing had changed. No prints in the soil, no sign of intrusion, just the faint trace in the ditch where those two light steps had been. I packed quickly, not wanting to turn my back on the tree line for too long. When I finally shouldered my pack and stepped onto the road, the forest felt heavier somehow, like the air itself was leaning in to watch me go. I kept expecting the steps to follow, but they didn't. They stayed behind, locked into that slow circle around the empty camp, as if I'd been nothing more than a passing moon in their endless night. Story 3. A radio that answered back. I brought the radio because I liked how the ridges here caught sound and bent it, letting voices from far-off places slide through the air like they'd taken a wrong turn. It was an old AM set, scratched plastic casing, half the numbers worn off the dial. The handle squeaked when I carried it, and the antenna had to be pulled out slowly or it would catch. Most people bring phones or GPS when they camp this far out, but I wanted something that didn't depend on a signal I could measure. I liked the uncertainty of it. The campsite was nothing more than a flat patch beside a deer trail, the ground soft with pine needles and old leaves. I'd come in from the east ridge, following switchbacks until the trees thinned just enough to let me see a spill of moonlight on the valley below. There was no path here, not one you'd find on a map, just animal runs and the faint memory of a logging cut from decades ago. I set my tent, lit my lantern low, and settled in. The woods had that heavy quiet you only get when even the insects are holding still. It was after midnight when I turned on the radio. The first stations were static, then a burst of fiddle music so faint it could have been playing in another century. I kept turning and a voice slid in, male, steady, low, a preacher. He was talking about safety, how the righteous would not stumble if they stayed on the path. His tone was calm but certain, as if he'd said these words hundreds of times before. I glanced toward the deer trail, a pale line in the dark, and thought about how there was no real path here, just woods. I turned the volume down to a murmur. The preacher paused mid-sentence, and for a second I thought the signal had dropped. Then, clear as anything, my own voice came through the speaker. It said my name, plain and even, and told me to go to sleep. The sound was flat, metallic, like it had been recorded on an old answering machine and played back too many times. I froze, my hand still on the dial. The voice didn't come again. I twisted to static, the hiss filling the tent like rushing water. That's when the zipper at the entrance trembled, a tiny metallic buzz as if someone were tugging it a fraction of an inch. I told myself it was windy, but the air was still. Not a leaf moved outside. I turned the dial again, trying to shake off the unease. This time I caught a weather report from a county 2 states over, the announcer rattling off temperatures and rainfall totals in the flat tone of someone reading numbers off a page. The signal faded into another voice, men talking low, counting 1, 2, 3, then starting again. The cadence was deliberate, too regular for casual speech, but too quiet for me to make out anything else. I decided to test it. Leaning close, I whispered a question under my breath. What's the temperature in Milford? Milford's my hometown. A second later, the radio answered. Yesterday's temperature, not today. A detail small enough to explain away, but it landed in my chest like a weight. It felt like someone standing close enough to breathe against the back of my neck. The counting voices came back, and I shut the radio off. The tent seemed smaller in the silence, as if the fabric had drawn in by an inch or two. I lay down, but each time my eyes closed, I thought I heard faint movement just outside. Not walking, more like someone shifting their weight from foot to foot. Around 4 in the morning, I turned the radio on again, if only for company. The static cleared, and a woman's voice came through, smooth and calm, like she was talking over coffee. It was a local swap shop program, the kind where people call in to sell a few things. She listed canning jars, a used stove, a porch swing. Then she said she had a canvas tent for sale. Hardly slept in, she added, and described it in detail. Down to the patched corner I'd sewn myself last spring. I didn't move. The voice kept going, listing other items, but I couldn't listen. I just stared at the tent wall, lit faintly by the lantern's dying glow, feeling like the space between me and the fabric had stretched into something I couldn't measure. When the sky began to pale, I packed in silence. The radio stayed off, stuffed deep in my pack under the clothes. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of hush that makes you feel like you've stepped into a room where everyone has stopped talking. I left the deer trail and cut uphill, moving fast. Each time I stopped to catch my breath, the silence seemed to thicken, like it wanted me to fill it with something it could carry. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun had cleared the far hills. I sat there for a while, trying to tell myself it had been a coincidence. A lucky guess on the temperature, an old tent like mine, nothing more. But the sound of my own voice telling me to sleep kept replaying in my head, flat and distant, like it had been waiting there longer than I'd owned the radio. I haven't turned it on since, but some nights, when the wind shifts just right and the house settles, I swear I can hear the faint crackle of a signal, like someone is still out there, waiting for me to tune in. Story 4. Cold ashes in a warm fire. On the third night out, the cold had a different weight to it. The first 2 evenings, it had crept in politely, letting the fire push it back a little, like 2 animals testing each other's space. But by the third, it came steady and sure, settling in my bones before the sun had even finished slipping behind the ridge. My hands felt slow as I tried to coax the stubborn flame into life. I remember crouching over it, feeding it with the smallest dry twigs I had. The flame growing thin blue at the base, opening into clean orange tongues. It looked like the kind of fire you could trust, bright, upright, even dancing a little. I pulled my folding stool closer, set my palms toward it, and waited for the warmth to work its way through my fingers. Nothing came. I told myself to be patient, but the cold didn't retreat. If anything, it leaned closer, testing me. I reached for the poker I'd brought, a short length of steel rod, and nudged the nearest log. It collapsed too easily, falling in on itself with a sigh, spilling into a bed of pale grey ash. The strange thing was the feel, cool as flour against the metal. I held my hand near it and felt nothing. My breath showed in the glow like fog curling upward from the coals. I set my hand closer still, close enough that on any normal night I'd have jerked back from the heat. But there was no heat, only the shape and sound of a fire. I told myself it was some trick of the damp air, some quirk of the wood. I broke a dry twig from the bundle I'd kept under the tarp and laid it across the glowing bed. It didn't blacken, didn't even smoke. It just sat there, looking wrong against the light, like a shadow pinned in place. The woods around me seemed to lean in, the dark pressing at the edge of my lantern's throw. I felt the quiet differently now, less like absence of sound, more like something listening hard enough to hear the blood in my ears. The fire is one of those lies you accept out here, the little trick it plays telling you you're safe. It doesn't really keep things out, it keeps you believing they'll stay out. Whatever was happening now had stripped that lie bare, just to see what I'd do without it. I gathered fresh wood, stacked it neatly, and struck another spark from the flint. The tinder caught instantly, leaping to that same convincing orange, licking upward like it had every right to burn. But again, the warmth never came. I could see the shimmer of heat above it, yet my hands felt only the air's heavy chill. Across the narrow creek, a flicker caught my eye. Through the lattice of bare branches, another fire moved in the dark. Same size as mine, same orange pulse. It was far enough that I couldn't make out anything around it, but I could see it rise when mine rose, dim when mine dimmed. Not in delay, not in imitation. It was exact, like we were two mirrors facing each other, each locked to the other's motion. I stared long, enough for the edges of the flame to blur, my eyes watering from the cold. I thought about calling out, but didn't. My voice felt like something I should keep to myself. Instead, I reached for my pack and dug out the small camping stove I only used in bad weather. Lighting it inside the tent was a rule I'd been taught never to break, but the rules here had already gone soft, the ground shifting under what I trusted. The hiss of the gas stove filled the space, and soon I had a pot of water rolling. The steam curled past my face, warm and human, nothing like the false glow outside. I unzipped the tent just enough to glance back toward the fire. It was still there, burning wrong, and across the creek the twin burned wrong with it. I thought I saw movement between them, something tall enough to block the flicker for half a breath, but the light swam too much to be sure. I closed the zipper slow, sat with my back against the wall, and drank the hot water as if it would anchor me to something real. Sleep came in thin slices, each one broken by a faint sound. Sometimes the rush of the creek swelling louder than it should, sometimes the soft crack of a branch breaking in a way that felt watched. Around what I guessed was 3 a.m, I dreamed I was standing at the creek's edge, my fire and its twin on either bank. The water was black, reflecting only the flames, not me. The ash from both fires floated above the surface like snow that didn't fall. When I woke, the lantern was out, but the cold light of those flames still pulsed through the tent wall. I stayed inside until the pale wash of morning began to touch the fabric. When I finally stepped out, the fire ring held only damp stones, slick and dark. No wood, no ash. The ground was wet where it shouldn't have been, as if rain had fallen in a circle no wider than the ring itself. My boots left prints in the soft earth, but nothing else had disturbed the soil, not even across the creek where the other fire had been. I walked to the water's edge. The bank was bare, the ground packed flat in a way that didn't match the rest of the forest floor. I knelt and touched it. Cold, but not from the air. It was the deep cold of something that had been pulled out of the ground and left hollow. The creek moved slow here, almost too slow, its surface catching the weak light like old glass. I thought about trying to start another fire, just to prove to myself it would burn right now that daylight was here, but I didn't. I packed my stove, rolled the tent, and crossed the narrow bridge of stones without looking back. The ridge trail waited above, thin and winding, the kind that makes you feel watched, even with the sun on your shoulders. By the time I reached the car, the thought of the false fire felt distant, like something half-remembered from a fever dream. But that night, at home, I sat in my kitchen staring at the gas flame on the stove, blue at the base, orange at the tips. The air above it wavered in the familiar shimmer. I held my hand over it and felt the warmth climb into my palm. I should have been relieved. Instead, I thought about the way the twin flame had answered mine across the creek. I thought about how the ashes had been gone, the stones washed clean. The warmth in my hand suddenly felt thin, borrowed. I turned off the stove, and for a long while, I sat in the dark, wondering if the lie of the fire had followed me home, waiting for me to notice when it decided to stop burning again. Story 5. The third tent zipper at midnight. You learn to count sounds in these mountains because it's the only way to give shape to the dark. If you can count it, you can make it familiar. Make it something your mind can stack neatly instead of letting it spread wild in every direction. That night, the crickets were steady. 30 chirps in the first minute, then a pause, then back at it. A barred owl called twice from somewhere down the ridge, low and distant. The tent zipper went twice too. Once when I stepped out to check the guy lines after the wind shifted. Once when I gave up on staring into the black and crawled back inside. I lay there, the nylon walls breathing slow with me, the cold gathering in the corners, telling myself that was it for the night's inventory. But around midnight, I heard a third zipper. It wasn't rushed, it was patient and deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was pulling it had practiced the sound before, gotten used to the feel of each tooth sliding against the next. I froze, my hand half curled around the edge of my sleeping bag. The sound was close, so close I could feel the air in the tent shift slightly, as though some part of it had opened into a space that hadn't been there before. I waited for a hand to press in or a shadow to cross the thin line of light from my small lantern. Neither came. There was just the quiet afterward, which felt worse than the sound itself. I told myself I had to look. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the tent's yellow walls, showing nothing but the same seams, the same folds of fabric. When I unzipped the flap and leaned out, the cold bit hard at my face. The zipper was shut tight, exactly where I'd left it. But across the tent's footprint, running from one side to the other, was a stripe of disturbed leaf litter, no wider than a belt. The forest floor on either side was untouched, soft with weeks of fallen leaves, but here it was neatly parted, like something had passed directly underneath me and carried the ground aside without breaking it. I tried to write it off as some trick of wind or water, but the slope above camp was dry, and no stream ran close enough to explain it. I zipped the flap closed, double-checked the pulls, and settled back down, though my breathing was shallow now, not out of fear so much as caution. The dark seemed heavier. My ears stayed open, listening for the rhythm of insects, the creak of trees. It came, but between the notes there was something else. The kind of stillness that isn't empty, but waiting. Sleep, when it came, was thin and strange. I dreamed of curtain hems brushing against my ankles, the whisper of cloth moving in a draft that didn't touch my face. I walked in narrow hallways made of canvas, the walls close enough that my elbows brushed them, the ceiling so low I had to keep my head bowed. Every so often a seam would open and reveal another corridor, stretching longer than I could see, the fabric breathing in and out, as though the tent itself were alive. I followed the sound of a zipper opening somewhere far ahead, but no matter how many corners I turned, I never caught up. I woke before dawn, unsure if the sound in my dream had pulled me out of sleep, or if something in the real dark had. Then I heard it again. The zipper moaned this time, longer, slower, like it had swollen and needed more effort to move. The air inside the tent felt different, heavier, cooler, as if a narrow passage had grown behind me while I lay still. I didn't turn right away. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the faint shadow of the ridgepole above me, every muscle locked in place. The cold pooled along my spine, spreading down into my hips and legs like water finding its level. When I finally rolled over, there was nothing to see, just the same thin nylon, lit faintly by the early light outside. But the smell in the air was wrong, damp, earthy, like rain had fallen close by, though the ground outside had been dry when I'd last checked. I ran my fingers along the zipper seam and they came away with a faint line of moisture. It wasn't enough to drip, just enough to slick my skin. The sensation made my stomach turn. It felt less like water and more like a tongue had pressed there, testing the teeth. I unzipped the flap in one quick motion, but the forest outside was still. No footprints, no broken branches, only the same narrow stripe of disturbed leaf litter, faint but visible now in the weak light. It hadn't widened or faded, it simply existed, a mark that felt permanent in a place where everything else shifted with the season. I crouched there, looking from one end of the stripe to the other, trying to picture how anything could have moved beneath my tent without collapsing the ground. I couldn't make sense of it. I packed slow that morning, not out of laziness, but because the air felt like it was watching me, and I didn't want to give it the satisfaction of seeing me hurry. The zipper held as I stuffed the tent into its sack, but I noticed the metal pull was colder than it should have been for the temperature. I kept my gloves on after that. The hike out was quiet, even the owl had gone. I counted my steps instead of the forest sounds, telling myself each one carried me farther from the stripe, from the hallways in my dream, from the sense of fabric breathing just behind my back. That night, safe in my house, I set the tent up in the garage to check for damage. The seams were intact. The zipper teeth were all aligned. I ran the pull up and down the length of it, and it made the same familiar sound. Soft, unremarkable, nothing that should hold in my mind. But when I closed my eyes, the sound didn't stop. It stretched out, slowed, and I could feel that cool dampness along my spine again, as if somewhere the corridor had found me, and all it needed was one more pull to open. Story 6. Lights Moving. Where no road exists, from the ridge, I could see 3 hollows and a narrow slice of sky, the kind of view that makes you feel both high above the world and too exposed to belong there. The sun had gone down clean, leaving no color, just the slow fade into a blue so deep it was almost black. Below me, the ridges folded into one another until they blurred, the shapes of trees becoming nothing more than the grain of shadow. I'd been there since late afternoon, my tent staked in the thin grass just shy of the tree line, stove cooling from the last of my coffee, nothing left to do but watch the night take the valley. I wasn't expecting company, not here, not this far in. That's why the first light caught me wrong. It eased through the trees below, white at first, gliding between trunks in a way no flashlight beam should. Then a second appeared behind it, this one amber, the two keeping their distance like strangers walking the same path. A third joined, faint and low, and together they moved in a quiet convoy across the slope. There was no road there, only the old logging cuts I'd crossed earlier and a creek that braided itself thin enough to vanish in places. The lights hesitated at a bend I knew the creek took, then resumed, each maintaining that careful space from the next. I pulled my phone from my jacket and tried to film, but the screen showed only darkness, my own breath clouding the lens. I wiped it and tried again. Nothing. The lights kept on, not hurrying, not slowing, as if they had all the time in the world. I told myself it could be hunters, though there was no reason for them to be here at night, this far from the road. The air around me felt heavier now. The cold no longer a thing on my skin, but something in my chest. When the lights reached the base of my ridge, they stopped. The stillness that followed made the night feel close in a way I can't explain, as if the dark had leaned forward to listen. Then, slowly, the lights fanned out. One stayed low, another slid uphill toward the edge of the creek. The third moved in a broad arc that brought it nearer to my side. I didn't hear footsteps, no snapping of twigs, no shifting of leaves, only my stove giving a soft ping as it cooled, the sound far too loud in the new quiet. Every noise I made seemed to carry, like it was reporting itself. My gloves against my jacket, the shift of my boots in the grass, each sound announced me. I cupped my hands and called down, asking if someone was lost, the words trembling more than I meant them to. The lights went out together like someone had shut a door. The darkness that followed wasn't the same as before. It felt deliberate, like being left alone in a room you didn't know you'd been sharing. I didn't move. Not because I was afraid of making noise, but because moving would have meant admitting I was waiting for something to happen. My knees began to ache from the crouch, but I stayed there, eyes straining into the dark, trying to remember exactly where each light had been before it vanished. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, and nothing returned. The stars above seemed sharper, smaller, as if they'd been poked through a drum's skin. Sometime before dawn, I must have drifted into that shallow, restless half-sleep you get when you're too alert to rest, but too tired to hold yourself up. I opened my eyes to a faint glow, not ahead of me where the lights had been, but far upslope, behind my camp. One light. It didn't flicker, didn't scan. It moved with the steady, unbothered pace of someone walking home late, familiar with every step. It passed my tent without pausing, without even angling toward me, and kept on into the trees. I lay there, watching the glow fade, and felt something I didn't want to name. It wasn't relief. It wasn't fear exactly either. It was the realization that I had been allowed to see what I'd seen, and that allowance could just as easily be taken away. When the light was gone, the ridge felt empty again, but not in the way it had before sunset. Now it felt emptied, as though something had left on purpose. I packed slowly when the morning finally came. The hollows below were just shadows again, nothing unusual about them, no trace of where the lights had passed. The creek made its way along the bend I'd watched them pause at, gurgling over stones as if nothing had stood there the night before. The logging cuts were silent, overgrown in places with thin pine, others bare enough to show the hard-packed soil beneath. I told myself all the reasonable things. Hunters, surveyors, maybe even campers like me moving between sites. But the explanations felt thin, stretched over something larger I couldn't quite see. The memory that stayed with me wasn't the sight of the lights moving in the valley. It was that single glow passing behind me, too close for me not to have heard it, yet making no sound at all. The hike out took longer than it should have. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the ridge, half expecting to see one of those lights sliding through the trees in daylight. I didn't. The forest looked normal, the air warmer, the creek smaller. By the time I reached my car, I'd almost convinced myself it had all been some trick of the eyes, the distance, the cold. But that night, back home, I stood at my kitchen window long after I'd turned off the lights inside. The street outside was empty, the houses dark. Then, far down the block, a single light moved. Not a car, not a porch light, but something carried at chest height, steady and unhurried. It turned the corner without looking toward me and disappeared. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I'd been imagining it. But I left the blinds closed after that, and I haven't camped on that ridge again. Story 7. A map that wouldn't stay put. I keep paper maps because batteries go nervous in the cold. They've never failed me, at least not in ways I couldn't work around. So when I set out on that stretch of ridge, I carried a topo that had been folded and refolded until the creases felt as familiar as my own knuckles. Somewhere along the western edge of the print, there was a spur trail marked in fine black dashes, dropping to a spring indicated by neat blue tick marks. It looked ordinary, the kind of detail you trust instantly. A small patch of certainty in a place where landmarks change with the seasons. That afternoon, I folded the map so that square sat in the center and slid it into the mesh pocket of my tent. The air had a bite to it, and I wanted the spring marked for morning. When I checked the map again an hour later, the fold had shifted. The spring was still there, but it wasn't where I'd left it. Instead of sitting snug in the middle of the creases, it had wandered uphill on the paper, as if the land itself had moved in my absence. I told myself, paper can't lie, though I knew it can be wrong. The thought left an itch in my stomach that no amount of staring at the contour lines could ease. I set it back in the pocket, careful this time to line the folds exactly. The next morning, with the cold thick enough to turn breath into a fog that lingered, I pulled the map and lined it against the ridgeline. My compass confirmed the heading. My eyes confirmed the distance. The spring should have been just under a half mile down the spur. The trail itself was faint, but there. Damp leaves matted underfoot, the occasional blaze on a tree trunk fading with age. I dropped steadily until the incline flattened into a hollow. The smell reached me first. Not the clean mineral scent of water, but iron, sharp and metallic. The stones there were black with wet, slick under my boots, but no water ran between them. In the center lay a perfect circle of mud, dark as oil and smooth as glass, reflecting the sky too clearly for the depth it pretended to have. My own reflection stared back, edged with the thin winter branches overhead. I crouched and touched the surface. It held firm under my fingertip before giving just enough to stain my skin. The iron smell clung to my hand all the way back to camp. When I returned, the map wasn't folded to the spring anymore. It had refolded itself to the margin where I'd written my name in pencil, the letters now creased down the center as if the paper had been trying to tuck me in. The spring square was hidden entirely, buried under layers of contour and symbol. I didn't remember leaving it like that. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I dreamed of the blue tick marks marching one by one across the page, orderly as ants carrying sugar grains. They moved without hurry, leaving blank space behind them, until they reached the edge and vanished into the fold. The sound they made was almost a whisper, like graphite dragging slow across paper. At dawn, the map lay flat inside the tent, unfolded completely. A new pencil line had been drawn, thin but certain, starting from the fire ring outside my tent, tracing my exact boot path to the edge of the laurel. The line stopped there, at the thicket's edge, as if it were waiting for me to finish it. I hadn't drawn it. My pencil was still capped inside my pack. The laurel wall was thick enough that stepping into it meant leaving the ridge behind. I stood there a long while, map in hand, staring at that unfinished line. The forest on the other side felt heavier, the air quieter, the kind of quiet that doesn't just happen, it's made. I folded the map once, twice, until the line was hidden, and set it in the pocket again. That evening, while the wind rattled the tent fabric, I pulled the map back out. The fold had shifted again. The line to the laurel was no longer hidden. It was right there in the center, waiting, but now it was longer by a fraction of an inch. It went just beyond the thicket. I didn't want to see what lay past it. I burned the map the next morning. I thought about tearing it, but the idea of touching those lines with my bare hands made my skin crawl. I set it in the fire ring, struck a match, and watched the flames curl the edges inward. The paper browned, bubbled, and finally crumbled into grey ash that lifted in the light breeze. When the wind shifted, the ash didn't scatter randomly. It drifted in a slow, narrow stream toward a gap in the trees, the same direction the pencil line had been pointing. I packed quickly, more from instinct than decision, and started down the ridge. The forest felt different now, as if I were walking in the negative space of the map, filling in places that hadn't been meant to exist until I stepped into them. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the gravel road where my car waited, I couldn't remember the exact shape of the spur trail or the hollow. That night at home, I caught myself reaching for the tent pocket, forgetting the map was gone. The absence of its familiar weight felt like a loose thread I shouldn't pull. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, half expecting to hear that soft, dragging whisper of pencil on paper. I didn't, but when I closed my eyes, I saw the map as it had been in my dream, blank except for one thin line, starting at where I lay and stretching into a place I couldn't see, the end of it always just waiting for me to take the next step. Story 8. The cabin stove that kept breathing. The storm started as a smear on the horizon, the kind that makes you think you have hours before it reaches you. But in the mountains, time belongs to the weather. By the time I'd reached the old logging road, the rain was already slanting through the trees, sharp enough to sting my cheeks. I hadn't planned to stop, but the wind was pushing hard, and the cold had that particular weight that seeps into the bones. That's when I saw it. A narrow shape off to the side, half hidden in laurel, more shadow than structure until the lightning caught it. A cabin, or close enough to one to call it shelter. It had 4 walls that leaned just enough to make you question their patience, a sagging porch with railings like missing teeth, and a roof patched in a dozen different shades of tin. The door was unlatched, and I pushed it open with my boot, the hinges complaining in long, low notes. The smell inside was old pine tar and dust, with a faint sweetness that reminded me of wood smoke that's had too long to think about itself. I checked for animals, just habit, and found only a nest of hickory nuts gathered in the imprint of an old boot left by the hearth. A calendar hung crooked on the wall, its pages curled. The year was from a decade I'd lived through, but the images looked farther away, as if time had slowed here in a way it hadn't outside. The stove sat in the center of the far wall, rusted and heavy, its pipe disappearing into a roof patched with mismatched tin. I knelt to open it, brushing away a scatter of old ash, and struck a match. The flame caught on the first curl of paper and climbed into the kindling. That's when I heard it, an exhale, not the pop and crack of wood warming, not the rush of air through the flue. This was long and slow, like something inside had lungs. The sound carried weight, a presence pressing outward into the room. I told myself it was just the draft, the way cold and heat argue in tight spaces, but the noise made my shoulders tense. Still, the fire steadied, and the air in the cabin softened, warmth creeping into my hands. I set my lantern on the table and pulled a chair close, figuring the storm would pass before I needed to worry about sleep. Without warning, the stove inhaled, a deep pull, so strong the door clicked shut on its hinges. The lantern flame beside me flattened, pressed low as if a boot heel had come down on it. My ears popped from the pressure. The air felt emptied for a second, like the whole room had paused its breathing to match the stove's. I moved to open a window, thinking the draft needed breaking. But when the latch gave and I pushed it out, the rain's chill wasn't what hit me first. Something leaned in, not a weight on my shoulder, not a hand, but a presence close enough to feel the hair along my neck lift. It was the way a person leans beside you to see what you see, head angled just over yours. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. The stove exhaled again, slower this time, almost careful, before drawing another breath. Long inhale, longer hold, brief sigh. The rhythm crept into my chest, syncing with my own without permission. It was a rhythm I recognized. It was the breath I fall into when I'm pretending to sleep, trying to convince someone in the room that I'm not listening. I sat back, putting the wall against my spine as if it could keep me from being drawn into whatever game this was. I let the fire shrink until only embers remained, the heat dropping away, the shadows pushing forward. The stove kept breathing. Even without flame, it inhaled and exhaled, metal groaning faintly with each pull. The rain outside slowed, but the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. I stayed in the chair until my legs ached. Every so often, a draft would slip across the floor, not from the window, but from the space between me and the stove, like someone moving past without wanting to be noticed. I didn't sleep, but my body loosened in that strange way, where you're not awake enough to react and not asleep enough to be safe. In those half-aware moments, the breathing seemed to come from the walls as well, the timbers expanding and settling in time with the stove, the whole cabin practicing the shape of being lived in. By morning, the firebox was empty, the stovepipe cold, but the metal ticked in small, precise beats, like a watch measuring time in a room that didn't own any. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards groaning under me. The storm had left a film of mud across the clearing, and in that mud, just beyond the first patch of grass, was a heel mark, larger than mine. Not fresh enough to have been made during the storm, not old enough to have been there before it. It sat by itself, no matching prints leading away, pressed deep like someone had stood still for a long time. I packed my things in silence, though I'd brought little to unpack. I didn't touch the stove again. As I stepped off the porch, I glanced back once. The window I'd opened was shut now, though I hadn't closed it. The glass caught the morning light, and for an instant I thought I saw movement behind it. Slow, deliberate, the same pace as breathing. I turned away before it could match mine again. The trail back down was slick with runoff, but the sky had cleared, the air fresh in that post-storm way that makes you want to believe nothing bad can cling to you out here. Still, the memory of that sound stayed in my chest, my own breathing falling into its rhythm without me meaning it to. That night, in my bed at home, I caught myself holding my breath, waiting for something else to exhale first.